Imagine a world where no matter how hard most people work, they will never get ahead. A world where just 20% of people control 80% of the wealth. This isn't fantasy or dystopian fiction. It's the reality we live in, and it's governed by a hidden mathematical law that shapes everything from our economy to your personal finances. And once you understand it, you'll never see success, wealth, or opportunity the same way again. What if I told you there's a mathematical principle so powerful that it determines who gets rich and who stays poor? A silent force that has dictated the flow of wealth for centuries, operating in the shadows of our economy, influencing everything from Wall Street to your salary. This invisible law doesn't care about your background, your education, or even how hard you work. And understanding it might be the difference between financial struggle and abundance. Before we continue, if you enjoy unraveling hidden truths and uncovering the forces that shape our world, make sure to click that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you the insights that truly challenge how we think. Now let's go deeper. In the late 19th century, an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto made a disturbing discovery. While studying patterns of wealth and land ownership in his country, he noticed something that shouldn't have been possible in a fair world. Approximately 80% of the land was owned by just 20% of the population. This seemed like it might be a quirk of Italian society, but as Pareto expanded his research, he found the same pattern occurring across different countries and throughout different time periods. The distribution wasn't random, it wasn't temporary, and it wasn't just about land. Pareto observed the same pattern in his garden where 20% of his pea plants produced 80% of the peas. He began looking for this pattern elsewhere and found it virtually everywhere he looked. The consistency was uncanny, almost supernatural. This mathematical relationship, where roughly 80% of effects come from 20% of causes, has since been observed in countless domains. In business, 20% of customers typically generate 80% of revenue. In software development, 20% of the bugs cause 80% of the crashes. And in global wealth distribution, the numbers are even more extreme. The richest 8% of people own 85% of global wealth. But this isn't just about statistics. It's about the fundamental mechanics of how resources concentrate in our world. The Pareto principle, as it came to be known, reveals an uncomfortable truth. Our world is naturally unequal, and this inequality follows predictable mathematical patterns. Success, wealth, and resources don't distribute evenly. They concentrate, creating a world where a small minority holds the majority of power and wealth. Think about the music industry. There are millions of musicians in the world, but only a tiny fraction, less than 1%, earn the vast majority of all streaming revenue and concert ticket sales. The top 0.1% of artists earn approximately 50% of all music revenue. This isn't because they're 500 times more talented or work 500 times harder. Is the Pareto principle at work, magnified by our networked economy? Consider the book publishing industry. Of the roughly 2.2 million books published each year globally, fewer than 1% account for more than 50% of all book sales. The overwhelming majority of authors struggle to make a living, while a select few become multimillionaires. The same pattern repeats in film, where blockbuster movies command budgets and box office returns hundreds of times greater than independent films, despite not necessarily being hundreds of times better. The crucial question is, why does this happen? Why does wealth naturally concentrate rather than distribute evenly? To understand this, we need to examine something economists call cumulative advantage, or more colloquially, the rich get richer effect. Imagine two entrepreneurs starting businesses with nearly identical ideas. One happens to get a small early advantage. Perhaps they secure a key client first or receive a favorable review. This small initial advantage attracts slightly more customers, which generates slightly more revenue, which allows for slightly more investment and growth, which attracts even more customers. Over time, these small advantages compound exponentially. Scientists and mathematicians have another name for this phenomenon: positive feedback loops. In systems with positive feedback, outputs become inputs for the next cycle, amplifying initial conditions. A snowball rolling downhill captures this concept. As it gains mass, it can gather snow more efficiently, growing faster and faster. In wealth accumulation, money works the same way. The first million is the hardest. Each subsequent million becomes progressively easier because you have more capital working for you. This compounding effect explains why wealth distribution follows the Pareto pattern rather than a normal bell curve. Advantage begets advantage. Money makes money, and those with resources can use them to generate even more resources in ways that those without cannot. Take Bill Gates, for example. Was he uniquely brilliant? Absolutely. Did he work incredibly hard? Without question. But so did thousands of other software developers in the 1970s and 80s. What separated Gates wasn't just skill or effort, it was access to a rare resource. One of the few computer labs in the country when he was in high school. This early advantage compounded over time. Small leads became larger ones, and eventually, Microsoft dominated an industry that made Gates one of the wealthiest humans in history. The same pattern applies to Jeff Bezos. His initial success with Amazon wasn't just about vision and execution. It was also about timing and initial advantages. Bezos had worked on Wall Street and had access to capital and connections that most entrepreneurs could only dream of. He started with $250,000 from his parents, a sum beyond the reach of most Americans. This initial advantage allowed him to weather years of losses that would have bankrupted entrepreneurs with less cushion. The result? A trillion-dollar company and one of the greatest fortunes ever amassed. Now, let's examine something even more profound. How the Pareto principle creates a mathematical inevitability that challenges our cultural narratives about wealth and success. We're taught that hard work leads to success, and while effort certainly matters, the math of Pareto distributions tells us something different. In a system governed by power laws, input and output are not linearly related. Working twice as hard doesn't necessarily get you twice the results. Instead, tiny differences in talent, opportunity, or positioning can lead to wildly different outcomes. Consider Olympic athletes. The difference between a gold medalist and fourth place, between immortality and obscurity, might be measured in hundredths of a second. The athlete who finishes fourth worked nearly as hard, sacrificed nearly as much, and demonstrated nearly the same skill as the gold medalist. Yet the rewards, both financial and in terms of opportunity, differ by orders of magnitude. This isn't because the gold medalist worked 10 times harder. It's because our reward systems amplify small differences in performance into massive differences in outcome. The top violinist in a world-class orchestra isn't just marginally better than the fifth chair. Yet the difference in their recognition and opportunities might be exponential. The highest grossing actor isn't necessarily 100 times better at acting than those struggling for roles, but they might command 100 times the salary. This non-linear relationship between input and output creates a winner-take-most dynamic that shapes entire industries. In technology, we see how network effects allow platforms like Facebook, Amazon, and Google to dominate their respective markets. Once a platform reaches a critical mass of users, each additional user makes the platform more valuable, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that's nearly impossible for competitors to break. Facebook wasn't the first social network. Remember MySpace, Friendster, or 6 Degrees? But once Facebook gained a critical mass of users, the value of being on the platform where everyone else was created an insurmountable advantage. The same pattern appears with Amazon's marketplace, Google's search engine, and Microsoft's operating system. Small initial advantages convert into dominant market positions through the mathematics of network effects and the Pareto principle. But the Pareto principle doesn't just affect economics. It shapes our personal psychology around money in ways few recognize. Consider how we think about financial success. Society tells us that with enough dedication and hard work, anyone can climb the economic ladder. The reality, however, reflects something different. Economic mobility, the ability to move from one income class to another, has been declining for decades in many developed countries. Studies show that in the United States, a child born into the bottom 20% of the income distribution has less than a 1 in 20 chance of reaching the top 20% in their lifetime. Meanwhile, those born into the top 20% have about a 2 in 3 chance of staying there. This isn't just about individual choices, it's about systemic advantages that compound over time. Access to quality education, healthcare, social networks, and initial capital creates cumulative advantages that mathematically express themselves through the Pareto distribution. This disconnect between cultural narrative and mathematical reality creates cognitive dissonance. Those who succeed often attribute their success primarily to hard work and ability, underestimating the role of initial advantages and cumulative returns. Those who struggle despite working hard may internalize their challenges as personal failures, rather than recognizing they're facing a system that mathematically concentrates resources away from the majority. The psychological impact runs deeper still. Research in behavioral economics shows that humans have a fundamental need to believe in a just world, one where effort and virtue are rewarded appropriately. The reality of Pareto distributions challenges this belief, creating a form of cognitive dissonance that we resolve through various narratives about who deserves success and who doesn't. These narratives often focus on individual characteristics rather than systemic patterns, allowing us to maintain the comforting illusion that the economic world operates fairly. Now, here's where things get both fascinating and disturbing. The Pareto distribution isn't just resistant to change, it's self-reinforcing. Even when wealth is deliberately redistributed, the 80-20 pattern tends to reassert itself over time unless the underlying dynamics of accumulation are addressed. This has been observed in everything from communist revolutions to corporate restructurings. New people might occupy the top 20%, but the distribution itself reforms like a mathematical law of nature. Consider the Soviet Union, which began with the idealistic goal of creating an egalitarian society. Within decades, new hierarchies formed, with party officials and bureaucrats controlling disproportionate resources and power. The faces changed, the Pareto distribution reasserted itself. Similarly, when companies attempt to flatten hierarchies and equalize compensation, new forms of status and resource concentration typically emerge unless the fundamental dynamics of cumulative advantage are addressed. This isn't to say change is impossible, but it does mean that addressing wealth inequality requires understanding the mathematical principles driving it, rather than simply treating its symptoms. The forces that create Pareto distributions in wealth are the same forces that create them in other domains. Cumulative advantage, network effects, barriers to entry, and the inherent scalability of certain resources, particularly in a digital economy. Some societies have managed to moderate the extremes of Pareto distributions through deliberate policy choices. Nordic countries, for instance, have maintained relatively high economic mobility and lower inequality than many other developed nations. They've done this not by fighting against the mathematics of the Pareto principle, but by addressing the mechanisms of cumulative advantage, providing universal access to education and healthcare, implementing progressive taxation, and investing in public infrastructure that benefits all citizens. So if this pattern is so pervasive, what does it mean for your personal finances? How can understanding the Pareto principle help you navigate a world governed by its mathematics? First, it suggests that diversification alone may not be the optimal strategy. In a Pareto world, most of your returns will come from a small percentage of your investments or efforts. Instead of spreading resources evenly, the mathematics suggests identifying and doubling down on the areas yielding the highest returns. This is why venture capitalists expect most of their investments to fail while hoping for a few massive successes that carry the entire portfolio. The investment legend Peter Lynch called this approach finding 10 baggers. Investments that return 10 times their initial value. One 10-bagger in your portfolio can outweigh dozens of mediocre investments. This doesn't mean you should abandon diversification entirely. It means recognizing that not all diversification is created equal. The key is ensuring your portfolio includes potential exponential winners, not just safe but limited returns. Second, it highlights the critical importance of positioning. In a world where small advantages compound over time, placing yourself at leverage points where opportunities concentrate can be more important than incremental improvements in skill or effort. This might mean moving to industry hubs, joining growing platforms early, or acquiring skills with exponential rather than linear returns. Consider the difference between being an average programmer in Silicon Valley versus being the best programmer in a small town with few tech opportunities. The Silicon Valley programmer might have access to networks, capital, and opportunities that create cumulative advantages, while the small-town programmer might be more skilled but lack access to the ecosystem where technology wealth concentrates. The Pareto principle suggests that positioning often outweighs marginal advantages in skill or effort. Third, It explains why entrepreneurship and ownership consistently create more wealth than labor alone. When you work for a salary, your income is capped by time. There are only so many hours in a day. But ownership gives you a claim on value that can scale without your direct involvement, allowing you to benefit from the work of many rather than just your own efforts. This is why the truly wealthy rarely accumulated their fortunes through salaries alone. Even highly paid professionals like doctors and lawyers typically hit income ceilings unless they own practices or firms. The mathematics of wealth accumulation favor those who own assets that appreciate or generate income passively. Stocks, real estate, intellectual property, or businesses, rather than those who exchange time for money directly. But there's an unexpected twist in how the Pareto principle operates in the modern economy. One that few people recognize, but that creates extraordinary opportunity. The very nature of what constitutes the critical 20% is changing rapidly. In the industrial age, the vital resources were physical: land, factories, natural resources, and labor. These had clear limitations and were easily controlled. In the digital age, however, many of the most valuable resources are intangible: knowledge, networks, attention, trust, and information. These resources can be replicated at nearly zero marginal cost and distributed globally in an instant. Consider the wealth created by the top YouTube creators, Instagram influencers, or podcast hosts. Many started with nothing more than a smartphone and an internet connection, yet built audiences and influence worth millions. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie rose from obscurity to global recognition not just through traditional publishing channels, but through a TED Talk that went viral online, opening doors that would have remained closed in a pre-digital era. This shift means that while wealth inequality remains governed by the 80-20 rule, the barriers to entering the top 20% in many domains have radically transformed. Creating software, publishing content, or building a valuable network no longer requires massive capital investment. The gatekeepers who once controlled access to markets, media, and education have been disintermediated by technology. Consider how Kylie Jenner built a billion-dollar cosmetics empire with just a handful of employees, leveraging social media to reach customers directly rather than relying on traditional retail channels. Or how programmers in developing countries can now access global markets through platforms like Upwork or GitHub, bypassing local economic limitations that would have constrained their earnings in previous eras. The opportunity hidden within the mathematical reality of the Pareto principle isn't to fight against it, but to understand how to position yourself advantageously within it. The question becomes not how to overthrow the 80-20 distribution, but how to move yourself into domains and positions where you can become part of the vital 20% that generates disproportionate returns. This might mean identifying emerging platforms before they become saturated, developing rare and valuable skills that command premium prices, or building businesses in sectors where network effects or scale economies create winner-take-most dynamics. Understanding the Pareto principle doesn't mean accepting a predetermined fate. It means making strategic choices based on how resources actually concentrate rather than how we might wish they would. There's a deeper philosophical dimension to consider as well. The Pareto principle challenges our fundamental notions of fairness and desert. If success is partly a function of cumulative advantage rather than solely merit, what does this mean for how we structure our society? If wealth naturally concentrates according to mathematical principles rather than proportionally to effort or virtue, how should we think about economic justice? The philosopher John Rawls proposed a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance. Imagine designing a society without knowing what position you would occupy within it, whether you be born rich or poor, talented or ordinary, advantaged or disadvantaged. What kind of economic system would you design if you might randomly end up anywhere within it? This framework forces us to confront the tension between allowing the productive efficiencies of Pareto distributions while mitigating their potentially harmful extremes. Some argue that we should embrace the Pareto principle fully, allowing resources to concentrate without intervention because this drives innovation and efficiency. Others contend that excessive concentration creates social instability and wastes human potential when opportunities are systematically denied to those without initial advantages. The debate isn't just economic, it's moral and philosophical, touching on our deepest values about fairness, opportunity, and human flourishing. These aren't simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. But understanding the mathematical forces that shape our economic reality allows us to engage with these questions more honestly and effectively than denying or ignoring them. What's particularly fascinating is how the Pareto principle operates across different timescales. In the short term, it might mean that 20% of your daily activities produce 80% of your results. Over a career, it might mean that 20% of your professional decisions account for 80% of your advancement. Over a lifetime, it might mean that 20% of your financial choices determine 80% of your wealth accumulation. This fractal quality, where the same pattern repeats at different scales, suggests that the Pareto principle isn't just a statistical curiosity but a fundamental property of complex systems. Understanding it requires thinking in terms of leverage points and exponential returns rather than linear cause and effect. So where does this leave us? Is the Pareto principle a force for good or ill? The truth is that it's neither. It's simply a mathematical reality that describes how resources tend to distribute in complex systems. What matters is how we respond to this reality, both individually and collectively. On an individual level, understanding the Pareto distribution can help you make better decisions about where to invest your time, energy, and resources. Rather than fighting against the mathematics, you can work with them, focusing on high-leverage opportunities where small inputs might generate outsized returns. Practically speaking, this might mean regularly auditing your activities to identify which 20% are producing 80% of your desired outcomes. It might mean examining your investment portfolio to determine which assets have exponential potential rather than merely linear growth. It might mean reevaluating your career strategy to ensure you're positioning yourself in domains where the vital 20% is accessible rather than closed off. Collectively, acknowledging the reality of how wealth concentrates can lead to more effective policy approaches. Rather than simplistic solutions that ignore the underlying mathematics, we can design systems that harness the innovative potential of unequal distributions while mitigating their most harmful effects. This might include ensuring universal access to the building blocks of cumulative advantage, education, healthcare, high-speed internet, and basic financial services. It might mean implementing progressive taxation that moderates extreme concentration without eliminating the incentives that drive innovation and risk-taking. It might mean designing social safety nets that provide security without removing the dynamism that comes from allowing resources to flow toward their most productive uses. The Pareto principle isn't going away. It has shaped wealth distribution for centuries and will likely continue to do so. But by understanding it, by seeing this hidden force that decides who gets rich and who stays poor, we gain the power to navigate it more effectively and to build systems that work with its mathematics rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Here's the final revelation. The 80-20 rule isn't just about the distribution of wealth. It's about the distribution of impact. In your career, 20% of your efforts will likely produce 80% of your results. In your investments, 20% of your assets will generate 80% of your returns. In your relationships, 20% of your connections will create 80% of your opportunities. The question isn't whether this principle applies to your life. It's whether you're conscious of it, whether you're positioning yourself to benefit from it rather than being constrained by it. What makes this principle so powerful is its predictive value. Once you understand that resources naturally concentrate in asymmetric patterns, you can anticipate where value will flow before others see it. You can identify potential exponential returns while they're still in their early, linear-looking phases. You can distinguish between activities that might yield incremental improvements and those that might create step changes in your circumstances. Consider how this principle might apply to your own life. Which 20% of your habits provide 80% of your well-being? Which 20% of your relationships bring 80% of your joy or advancement? Which 20% of your possessions deliver 80% of your satisfaction? The Pareto principle invites us to focus not just on efficiency but on effectiveness. Not just on doing things right, but on doing the right things. The true advantage doesn't come from denying mathematical reality, but from understanding it deeply enough to use it as a lever rather than experiencing it as a limit. In a world governed by the 80-20 rule, awareness itself becomes a form of wealth. If this exploration of wealth distribution and the mathematical forces that shape our economy has made you think, challenged your assumptions, and sparked a deeper curiosity about the hidden principles governing our world, then make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with those who need to understand this fundamental truth about how wealth works. The Pareto principle may be an inescapable force, but with the right knowledge, you can make it work for you rather than against you.